Once upon a time, there was a woman named Felicia Adams. She was a poor widow who sold vegetables in the market to feed her 3 children. Life had been cruel to her since the death of her husband, leaving her with nothing but the burden of survival. Yet, despite her struggles, Felicia never allowed hardship to steal her kindness. Every morning, before the sun stretched its golden fingers across the sky, Felicia would wake up, gather the freshest vegetables she could find, and walk to the market with a heavy basket balanced on her head. She had no luxury, no savings, no one to rely on. Only the few coins she made daily, which barely put food on the table. One fateful afternoon, as she sat under the scorching sun, arranging the vegetables on her wooden tray, she noticed a small boy standing by the roadside. His school uniform was wrinkled, his shoes dusty, and his face buried in his hands as he sobbed uncontrollably. Felicia wiped the sweat off her forehead and watched him for a moment. People walked past him, too busy with their own lives to notice his pain. Something in her heart ached. She had seen suffering in many forms, but there was something about a child crying alone that struck her deeply. She pushed herself up from the stool and walked towards him. "My son, why are you crying?" she asked gently. The boy sniffled and looked up at her with teary eyes. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. "They sent me out of the exam hall," he mumbled. Felicia's heart tightened. "Why, my dear?" The boy wiped his face with the back of his hand. I couldn't pay my school fees," he said in a shaky voice. "The principal said I can't write my exams unless I bring the money." Felicia glanced at his worn-out shoes and the way he clutched his school bag like it was the only thing he had in the world. Her heart broke. "What is your name, child?" she asked. "Brian," he whispered. "Brian Anderson." Felicia nodded slowly. She had never met him before, but his pain felt familiar, too familiar. She knew the agony of helplessness, the bitterness of having nothing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small bundle of money she had earned that day. It wasn't much. In fact, it was the last of what she had, and she still needed to buy food for her own children. But as she looked at Brian, she knew there was no choice. "Come with me," she said, taking his hand. The boy hesitated for a moment, but something in her kind eyes gave him comfort. He followed her as they walked through the crowded market, through the dusty streets, until they reached his school. Felicia knocked on the principal's door, her heart pounding. When the door opened, a stern-looking man peered down at them. "Yes?" Felicia swallowed hard and stepped forward. "I want to pay the boy's school fees," she said, placing the money on his desk. The principal raised an eyebrow. "Are you his mother?" Felicia shook her head. "No, but that doesn't matter." The principal stared at her for a moment, then sighed and took the money. "Fine. He can go back to class." Felicia turned to Brian and smiled. "Go, my son. Do well in your exams." Brian's lips parted in shock. You used your money for me?" Felicia nodded. "Yes. One day when you grow up, do the same for someone else." The boy wanted to say something, anything, but no words came out. His heart swelled with gratitude, but before he could speak, Felicia was already walking away, disappearing into the crowded streets, back to her vegetables, back to her struggles. Little did she know, she had just changed a life forever. Brian sat in the exam hall, gripping his pen tightly. The words on the paper blurred as his mind drifted back to the woman who had saved him. If not for her, he wouldn't be sitting there at that moment. He would have been outside, wandering the streets, ashamed and hopeless. When the exam ended, he packed his books slowly, lost in thought. As he walked home, he kept hearing her words. "One day when you grow up, do the same for someone else." Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time, they were not tears of sadness, they were tears of gratitude. That evening, when he arrived home, his parents were sitting in their small living room. His mother, Linda Anderson, was sewing a torn piece of clothing while his father, Michael Anderson, leaned against the wooden chair, looking exhausted from a long day's work at the construction site. Linda looked up when she saw Brian enter. "My son, why do you look so tired?" Brian dropped his school bag and ran straight to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His body shook with emotion. "Mom, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Something happened today." Michael sat up, concern filling his eyes. "What is it, son? Did something go wrong in school?" Brian pulled back and wiped his tears. "I was sent out of the exam hall today because my school fees weren't paid." Linda gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God. Brian, why didn't you tell us?" Michael's face darkened with pain. "Son, you know things have been hard. I was hoping to get paid this week so we could settle it." His voice broke. "I never wanted you to suffer because of our struggles." Brian shook his head. "Dad, it's okay. Someone helped me." Linda and Michael exchanged confused glances. "Someone helped you? Who?" "A woman at the market," Brian said, his voice filled with admiration. "A vegetable seller named Felicia Adams." Michael frowned. "A vegetable seller?" "Yes, Dad," Brian said, his voice trembling. "She saw me crying on the street and asked me what was wrong. When I told her, she took me back to school and paid my fees." He paused and sniffed. "She used her last money to help me, even though she didn't know me." Silence filled the room. Linda clutched her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. "A stranger used her last money to help you?" "Yes, Mom. If not for her, I wouldn't have written my exams today." Michael stood up, his hands trembling. "Where can we find this woman?" "She sells vegetables in the market, Dad. I saw her sitting under a small umbrella, arranging her goods." Michael nodded firmly. "We must go and thank her." Linda wiped her tears and stood as well. "Yes, we must. If not for her, Brian's future could have ended today." Without wasting any time, they left their home and headed to the market, their hearts heavy with emotion. By the time they reached the marketplace, the sun had started to set, casting a golden glow over the crowded stalls. The air smelled of fresh vegetables, roasted corn, and the dust of the day's hustle. Brian led his parents through the narrow paths between traders, searching for Felicia. Then, he spotted her. She was sitting on a small stool, exhausted, her hands resting on her lap as she watched the last of the market crowd disappear. Her eyes were tired, but there was a certain peace in her posture. Brian's heart swelled. "That's her," he whispered. Michael and Linda exchanged glances before walking toward Felicia. Felicia noticed them approaching, and she sat up. She recognized Brian immediately and smiled warmly. "Ah, my son, how was your exam?" Brian's lips quivered. "I did well, ma'am," he said. Felicia patted his shoulder. "Good. That's all that matters." Linda suddenly knelt before Felicia, holding her hands tightly. "Madam Felicia," she sobbed, "thank you. Thank you for what you did for my son." Felicia's eyes widened. "Oh, no, no, my dear. Please stand up." She tried to lift Linda, but Linda refused. Michael, his voice thick with emotion, spoke next. "Ma'am, I don't know how to thank you. My wife and we have been struggling. I lost my job last year, and ever since then, it has been difficult. We had no way of paying Brian's fees, and we feared he might have to drop out. But you gave him a chance." His voice broke. "You saved our son's future." Felicia shook her head gently. "Please, don't thank me. I only did what I would want someone to do for my own children if I were in need." Linda finally stood up, wiping her tears. "But, ma'am, you gave your last money. What about your own children?" Felicia sighed, a small, weary smile on her lips. "God provides, my dear." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the little money he had. "Please take this. It's not much, but—" Felicia raised her hand, stopping him. "No, my son, I cannot take it. That boy," she gestured at Brian, "is enough of a reward for me. One day, he will become great, and that will be my blessing." Brian looked at her with deep admiration. "I will never forget you, ma'am," he said, his voice firm. Felicia smiled and patted his head. "Go and make me proud, my son." And with that, she returned to her vegetables, unaware that the small boy she had just helped would one day change her life forever. The years rolled by like waves on the shore, each one carrying Brian Anderson closer to his destiny. Though life remained tough for his family, Brian held onto the promise he had made in his heart, to become someone great and repay the kindness that saved him. From the moment Felicia paid his school fees, Brian became a different person. He no longer took his education for granted. He studied harder than ever, determined to make the sacrifice worth it. While his classmates played after school, Brian would sit under a tree with his books, solving math problems and reading for hours. Even when the candlelight at home burned out, he would sit by the window, using the faint glow of the streetlights to continue his studies. His teachers noticed his brilliance and dedication. "Brian, you have a bright future ahead," his mathematics teacher once told him. "If you keep working this hard, one day you'll become someone important." Those words fueled him. He ranked among the top students in his class, winning academic prizes and earning scholarships that helped lessen his parents' burden. But life wasn't easy. His father, Michael, continued to struggle with unstable jobs, sometimes going days without work. His mother, Linda, took in laundry and sewing jobs to help sustain the family. Yet, despite the hardships, Brian never complained. He knew where he was headed. After years of hard work, Brian completed high school with outstanding results. When university admissions were announced, he was accepted into one of the best institutions in the country to study petroleum engineering. It was a moment of joy and fear. Joy because he had gotten the opportunity of a lifetime, and fear because his family had no means to pay his tuition. Michael sat with Brian one evening, staring at the admission letter in silence. "Son, I wish I had the money to send you to school," he said, his voice laced with pain. Brian placed his hand on his father's. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll find a way." Determined not to let financial struggles kill his dreams, Brian applied for every scholarship he could find. He wrote countless essays, attended interviews, and pleaded with sponsors. After weeks of uncertainty, the letter arrived. He had won a full scholarship. Tears rolled down his face as he read the words over and over again. His dream was alive. His parents wept with joy. "God is faithful," Linda cried, hugging her son tightly. Felicia, upon hearing the news, smiled proudly. "I told you, my son. You will be great one day." And so, Brian packed his bags and left for university, carrying with him the weight of his family's hopes and the silent promise he had made to Felicia to never forget. University life was tough, but Brian was tougher. He excelled in his studies, became a leader among his peers, and made valuable connections in the engineering world. In his final year, he secured an internship at one of the biggest oil companies in the country. His intelligence and work ethic impressed the executives, and by the time he graduated, they offered him a permanent job. At just 24 years old, Brian Anderson became an engineer in one of the world's leading oil firms. His rise was swift. Within a few years, he was promoted, earning salaries that his family had once only dreamed of. He bought his parents a comfortable home, ensured his siblings went to good schools, and finally, after years of struggle, gave his family the financial security they had never known. Yet, amid all his success, there was one thing he had never forgotten: Felicia Adams. The name Brian Anderson became well known in the oil industry. He was no longer just a young engineer. He had risen to the position of senior project manager, leading multimillion-dollar projects across the country. His company valued his intelligence and dedication, and at just 30 years old, he became one of the youngest executives in the firm. Wealth poured into his life like a flood. He could afford the finest things: luxurious cars, a mansion, and a life of ease. But no amount of success could erase the memory of his past struggles. He remained humble, always remembering the long nights of hunger, the shame of unpaid school fees, and, most importantly, the kind woman who had changed his destiny with a single act of kindness. Brian spoke about Felicia Adams every chance he got. One evening, Brian was invited as a guest speaker at a grand business summit attended by top executives, politicians, and young professionals. As he stood on the stage, dressed in an elegant suit, he looked over the large crowd. Cameras flashed, and thousands of people listened in silence, eager to hear the secrets of his success. But Brian didn't start with business strategies or investment tips. He began with a story. "Once upon a time," he said, his deep voice carrying across the hall, "there was a poor widow named Felicia Adams who sold vegetables in the market." He narrated how she had found him crying on the street the day he was sent out of school. He described how she had spent her last money to pay for his fees, asking for nothing in return. "I was just a small boy in a school uniform," hopeless and abandoned. She didn't know me. I was nothing to her. And yet, she chose to help me. The hall was silent. Some people dabbed at their eyes. Others shook their heads in disbelief. If not for that woman, I wouldn't be standing here today. I would have been lost in the cycle of poverty, just another forgotten boy on the streets. But she saved me. He took a deep breath and looked directly at the audience. That is why I stand here today, not just as a successful engineer, but as a man with a mission, to remind the world that one act of kindness can change a life forever. Thunderous applause erupted. People rose to their feet, clapping, some even wiping away tears. The speech was recorded and shared on social media. Within hours, it went viral. Thousands of people watched and shared it, deeply touched by the story of Felicia's kindness. Newspapers and television stations covered the story. People across the country were moved by the tale of a simple vegetable seller who had unknowingly shaped the future of one of the most successful engineers in the nation. Business leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens were inspired. Many came forward, offering to help struggling students just as Felicia had helped Brian. Scholarships were established in her honor. Felicia's name spread far and wide, even though she remained unaware of the impact she had made. Despite the overwhelming success, Brian felt that his work was not yet done. "It's time to find her," he whispered to himself one night as he stared out of his mansion's balcony. It had been many years since that day in the market. He had no idea where she was, but he was determined to search for her, no matter how long it took. And so, with the full force of his resources, Brian Anderson began the most important search of his life. The search for the woman who had saved him. Brian Anderson had all the wealth and influence a man could dream of, but none of it mattered until he fulfilled the promise he had made to himself, to find Felicia Adams and change her life the way she had changed his. He sat in his luxurious office, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany desk as he stared at the city skyline through the glass windows. His heart was restless. He had told the world about the woman who saved him, but he had yet to do the most important thing, thank her in person. Felicia Adams had given him everything when she had almost nothing. Now, he had everything. It was time to give back. Brian picked up his phone and called his personal assistant, Richard Coleman, a man who had worked with him for years and understood the weight of his emotions. "Richard, I need you to help me find someone." Richard immediately sensed the urgency in his boss's voice. "Of course, sir. Who are we looking for?" "Her name is Felicia Adams. She used to sell vegetables in the marketplace years ago. She's the woman who paid my school fees when I was a child." Richard had heard the story before, but this was the first time Brian had made it a personal mission to find her. "Consider it done, sir," Richard assured him. Within an hour, Brian's team of private investigators was on the case. They combed through market records, questioned traders, and searched every corner of the city. Days passed, but Felicia seemed to have vanished. Many of the market women remembered her, but didn't know where she had gone. Some said she had stopped selling vegetables years ago. Others thought she had moved to another town. He personally went to the market where she had once worked, dressed simply in a button-down shirt and jeans, far removed from his usual executive appearance. He walked through the familiar streets, the same ones he had once run through as a child. "Excuse me, ma'am." He approached an elderly woman selling tomatoes. "Do you know a woman named Felicia Adams? She used to sell vegetables here years ago." The woman squinted at him, studying his face. "Felicia, yes, I remember her. A good woman. She used to sit right there." She pointed to an empty spot under a faded umbrella. "But she left the market a long time ago. Do you know where she went?" Brian asked, hope rising in his chest. The woman sighed. "I heard she was struggling. Things became hard for her. She left to find work elsewhere." Brian's stomach twisted. Struggling? He couldn't bear the thought of Felicia suffering while he lived in luxury. "Please, if you hear anything about her, let me know." He handed her a business card. "I will, son," she promised. Days turned into weeks, but Brian refused to give up. He intensified the search, expanding his team's reach to other towns and villages. Then, one evening, Richard rushed into Brian's office, out of breath. "Sir, we found her." Brian froze. His heart pounded. "Where?" She's living in a small village on the outskirts of town, Richard said. From what we gathered, life has been very difficult for her. Brian swallowed hard. Take me there. Brian drove himself. He couldn't wait. The car sped down narrow roads, leaving behind the bright city lights as he entered a poorer neighborhood. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The village was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Small houses stood scattered along the road, their walls worn with age. Then, at last, he saw her. Felicia Adams was sitting outside a small, crumbling house, peeling cassava with wrinkled hands. Her once dark hair was now streaked with gray, her face lined with years of hardship. Brian's chest tightened. She looked so much older, so much weaker. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, his eyes burning with unshed tears. Then, he stepped forward. Do you remember me? Felicia looked up as she heard footsteps approaching. Her eyes met Brian's, but there was no recognition. To her, he was just another well-dressed man, a stranger. Good evening, ma'am, Brian said, his voice thick with emotion. Felicia gave him a tired smile. Good evening, my son. How can I help you? Brian knelt before her, tears filling his eyes. Ma'am, do you remember a small boy many years ago who was crying because he was sent out of school? Felicia's brows furrowed in thought. Many children have come to me over the years, son. I don't. I was that boy, Brian whispered, his voice shaking. You took me back to school. You paid my school fees with the last money you had. Felicia gasped softly, her hands trembling. Brian took her frail hands in his. You saved my life. Felicia's eyes widened as realization hit her. The memories flooded back. The little boy, his tears, the desperate need in his eyes that had moved her to give everything she had. Her lips trembled. My God, she whispered. Brian nodded, tears now streaming down his face. I made a promise that day. I told myself that if I ever became successful, I would find you and take care of you the way you took care of me. He squeezed her hands. I've come to fulfill that promise. Felicia was speechless. She simply stared at him, overwhelmed. Come with me, Brian said gently. You will never suffer again. Felicia broke down in tears. At that moment, she realized that the small act of kindness she had done so many years ago had come full circle. Brian lifted her up from the ground, guiding her towards the car. From that day on, Felicia Adams' life would never be the same. Felicia Adams sat in the passenger seat of Brian's luxurious car, her hands trembling on her lap. She still couldn't believe what was happening. Just hours ago, she had been sitting outside her small, crumbling house, peeling cassava for her evening meal. Now, she was being driven away by a man she had once helped as a small, helpless boy. A boy who had now become a powerful and wealthy man. Tears streamed silently down her wrinkled cheeks. Are you okay, ma'am? Brian asked, his voice thick with emotion. Felicia looked at him, her lips trembling. I don't understand, my son. I never expected this. Brian reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Ma'am, you gave me everything when you had nothing. Now it's my turn. Felicia lowered her head, overwhelmed with gratitude. As the car moved through the bumpy roads leading out of the village, Felicia turned and looked at the small house she had lived in for years. A house that had witnessed her tears, her hunger, and her silent prayers. Life had not been kind to her. After her husband passed away, leaving her with 3 children, she had struggled every single day to put food on the table. Selling vegetables in the market was her only source of income, and there were nights when she went to bed hungry so her children could eat. She had cried herself to sleep more times than she could count, wondering if her suffering would ever end. But despite her pain, she never stopped giving. Whenever she saw a child in need, her heart couldn't ignore them. She had always believed that kindness was more important than wealth, and that one good deed could change a life. She never imagined that her own act of kindness, helping a crying schoolboy years ago, would be the key to changing her own life. Felicia wiped her tears as the car approached a grand estate. The gates were tall, elegant, and heavily guarded. When they opened, she gasped. The driveway stretched for what seemed like miles, lined with perfectly trimmed hedges and beautiful flowers. The mansion standing before her was like something out of a dream, tall, white, and magnificent. Felicia couldn't breathe. This is where you live?" she muttered. Brian smiled. "Yes. And now, it's your home too." Felicia turned to him sharply, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" Brian stepped out of the car, walked around, and opened the door for her. He took her hand and led her inside. As soon as they stepped into the mansion, Felicia froze. The floors were polished marble, reflecting the golden chandelier hanging from the high ceiling. Large paintings decorated the walls, and plush furniture filled the enormous living room. "Welcome home," Brian said softly. Felicia covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, no, this is too much. I don't deserve this." Brian turned to her, his eyes serious. "You deserve this and much more. If not for you, I wouldn't be here today. This is not charity. This is me repaying a debt I can never fully repay." Felicia's knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably. Brian immediately knelt beside her, wrapping his arms around her like a son comforting his mother. "No more suffering, ma'am," he said. "No more hunger. No more pain. From today, your life changes forever." After she calmed down, Brian led her to a room, a grand bedroom designed just for her. The bed was soft, the air smelled of fresh flowers, and the curtains danced with the cool evening breeze. Felicia sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as they touched the silky covers. Never in her life had she imagined sleeping in a place so beautiful. Brian knelt before her and took her hands. "Your children," he said. "Where are they now?" Felicia's eyes dimmed with sadness. They left the city to find work in another place, but life has been hard for them too." Brian smiled warmly. "Not anymore. I will find them. I will give them jobs, homes, and everything they need." Felicia burst into fresh tears. You are too kind, my son," she sobbed. Brian wiped her tears. "You once called me your son when you took me back to school. You have no idea how much that meant to me. Now, let me be your son for real." Felicia hugged him tightly. For the first time in decades, her heart felt light. Brian wasted no time. Within days, he found Felicia's children, one by one. Her eldest son, Michael, had been working as a laborer in a construction site, barely earning enough to survive. When Brian's men found him and told him the news, he broke down in disbelief. Her second son, Joshua, was struggling in a mechanic shop, fixing cars for little pay. Her youngest daughter, Linda, was working as a cleaner in a small restaurant, exhausted and overworked. When they all arrived at Brian's mansion and saw their mother standing there, healthier and happier than they had ever seen her, they fell to their knees, crying. "Mother, how is this possible?" Michael asked, holding her hands. Felicia wiped his tears. "It's because of the kindness we showed years ago. God has remembered us." Brian gave them jobs in his company, salaries beyond their imagination, and homes of their own. Their days of suffering were finally over. The world soon learned about what Brian had done for the woman who once saved him. News stations covered the story. Social media exploded with posts about the widow who changed a millionaire's life. Many people were inspired. Some wept. Others rejoiced. Felicia's name became a symbol of kindness, proving that a single act of generosity could change the course of history. As she sat in the garden of her new home, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, God." For the first time in her life, she had no worries. Her story was proof that kindness was never wasted. It always came back, in ways beyond imagination. Felicia sat on the balcony of her new home. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and the laughter of her grandchildren echoed in the air. It still felt like a dream, one she feared waking up from. A year had passed since Brian changed her life. She no longer worried about money, food, or where her next meal would come from. She had everything she needed and more. Yet, in the midst of all this wealth and comfort, Felicia never forgot where she came from. One morning, she woke up with a deep conviction in her heart. She wanted to help others the way Brian had helped her. She called Brian and told him her thoughts. "My son, I want to help the widows and poor women in the market. Just as I struggled once, there are women out there selling vegetables, barely surviving. Some have children who have dropped out of school. Some sleep hungry. I want to change their lives too. Brian's face lit up with pride. Ma'am, I was hoping you'd say that. Let's do it. And so, a new journey began. Brian wasted no time. He provided the funds to start a foundation in Felicia's name, the Felicia Foundation for Widows and the Poor. Felicia, now full of energy and determination, went back to the market where she had once sold vegetables. She walked through the crowded stalls, observing the struggling women, their faces weary from years of hardship. She saw herself in them. She called a gathering and spoke from the depths of her heart. "My fellow women," she began, her voice shaking with emotion. "I was once like you. I know what it means to wake up before dawn, to carry heavy baskets of goods, to sell in the scorching sun, only to return home with barely enough to feed your children." Tears streamed down the faces of many women. "But today, I stand before you as proof that God sees us, even in our struggles. My life changed because of one act of kindness, and now, I am here to change yours." She then announced that her foundation would provide interest-free loans for women to expand their businesses, scholarships for children who had dropped out of school, housing support for widows struggling with shelter. The market erupted in cheers, women weeping and embracing each other. Felicia personally handed out the first set of scholarships to young children who had been sent home due to unpaid fees. As she placed each envelope in their small hands, she saw Brian in them, the little boy she once saved. One afternoon, as Felicia was about to leave the market, an old woman approached her, her body frail and her eyes filled with tears. She knelt before Felicia, holding her hands tightly. "God bless you, my daughter," the woman sobbed. "Because of you, my grandson will return to school. Because of you, I can expand my stall and feed my family." Felicia pulled her up, embracing her warmly. "No, Mama. It is God who has done it. I am only a vessel." Brian stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. His heart swelled with pride. The woman who had once saved him was now saving many others. He turned to his assistant. "Increase the foundation's funding. I want to see more lives changed." As the months passed, the story of Felicia's transformation and her foundation spread far and wide. News channels covered her work. People from all over the country sent donations. She was invited to speak at major events, and even government officials sought her advice on helping the poor. Despite all the recognition, Felicia remained humble. One day, Brian sat with her and smiled. "Ma'am, do you realize what you've done? You didn't just change your own life, you've changed thousands." Felicia sighed deeply, her eyes shining with gratitude. "My son, kindness is a seed. When you plant it, it grows into a tree that gives shade to many. You planted a seed when you returned to bless me. Now, the tree has grown." Brian blinked back tears. Years passed, and Felicia continued her mission, ensuring no widow or poor child was abandoned. On her 75th birthday, Brian organized a grand celebration in her honor. Dignitaries, celebrities, and even the president attended. But for Felicia, the real honor was the presence of the many lives she had touched. Children who had once been on the streets, now doctors, lawyers, and engineers, came back to pay tribute. Women who had once struggled, now successful business owners, knelt before her in appreciation. As Felicia looked around the hall, seeing the fruits of her kindness, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. She had once been a poor widow selling vegetables. Now, she was a mother to many, a savior to the helpless, and a light to the world. Her story was proof that one act of kindness could change generations.